Good evening. Howdy. How's everybody doing tonight? Doing well? Good. Well, what a blessing that we can come in here tonight. Tonight we're going to be a little bit different. We're excited that we're going to get to hear Jordan bring the word tonight, so be praying for him. God uses him to lead us, show us. But let's go ahead and stand together this evening. suffering, Lord, I will remember. What Calvary has fought for me, both now and forever. Oh God, you're so good. Oh God, you're so good. Oh God, you're so good. You're so good to me. Oh God, you're so good. Come on, let's sing it out. Oh God, you're so good. Oh God, you're so good. You're so good to me. Man. I heard an old story, how a Savior came from glory, how He gave His life on Calvary to save a wretch like me. I heard about His groaning, of His precious blood's atoning. Then I repented of my sins and won the victory. Oh, victory in Jesus, my Savior forever. He sought me and bought me with His redeeming blood. He loved me ere I knew Him, and all my love is to Him. He plunged me to victory beneath the cleansing blood. I heard about His healing, of His precious power revealing, how He made the lame to walk again and caused the blind to see. And then I cried, dear Jesus, come and heal my broken spirit. And somehow Jesus came and brought to me the victory. Oh, victory in Jesus, my Savior forever. He sought me and He bought me with His redeeming blood. He loved me ere I knew Him, and all my love is to Him. He plunged me to victory beneath the cleansing blood. I heard about a mansion He has built for me in glory, and I heard about the streets of gold beyond the crystal sea, about the angels singing and the old redemption story. Some sweet day I'll sing them there, song of victory. Oh, victory in Jesus, my Savior forever. He sought me and He bought me with His redeeming blood. He loved me ere I knew Him, with all the love
study your word, Father. We just thank you that it's the freedom we have, and Lord, let us not take lightly that freedom. So, Father, I just come to you and lift up this time. I lift up Jordan as he brings a message, and Lord, you just speak to each heart here. And in Jesus' name I pray.
All right, well, good evening. Glad to be here with you, and glad to worship together. Like Brother Robert's been saying in the mornings, we never want to take for granted the fact that we can meet together, we can worship together, and ministry can't happen if we're not together. We can't really love God and love others if we're not together. So we're real thankful for that. And for those that are watching online, we're also thankful for you and praying for when you can be here as well, but you're here tonight with us in spirit, and we're glad for that as well. The last few weeks, Brother Robert has been teaching on Elijah, some really neat lessons we can learn from him. I'm not actually sure where Brother Robert is tonight. He may have gone out of town. I'm not sure. It could be a mystery, but he asked if I could teach tonight, and I was going to let him continue on with Elijah. But one of the things I was thinking about is not everyone may understand how Elijah's story fits into the big picture. I'm a big picture guy. I really understand things when I can see the big picture, and if I can see it visually, I can understand how it all comes together and how to find it when I need to, and then I can focus just on learning it and applying it. That's a big deal for me, and I really think in the Old Testament, there's so many stories, so many characters, it's really hard to remember where everything is and where to find it, and how to put it all together as one big story. So that's what I wanted to do tonight, is look at how Elijah and his story fits into the context of God's bigger story in the Bible. So we're going to do some searching through the scriptures. We're going to have some slides up on the screen as well. I guess we can go ahead and put the first slide up. And I was thankful that Charlie prayed, because we always want to have God's words, not ours, and we want his power to live it out and do what he's called us to do. So we're thankful for that. Now, of course, just remember the big picture of the whole Bible itself is just one big letter from God revealing himself to us about God's good creation, and then the fall into sin, and then God's rescue plan for the world that starts in the Old Testament with Israel, and then finds its completion with Jesus in the New Testament. And then finally, the renewal of all things, which Nat has been talking about recently on Wednesday nights, which is the new heavens and new earth, where everything is put back to the way it was supposed to be. So if you can remember creation, fall, rescue, renewal, that's just one way to summarize that story. I'm not sure, Reagan, with the Awana kids, the middle school and high school, if y'all are doing the story right now with them. But they're learning the big picture story on Sundays at 4 o'clock, 6th through 12th graders, so that's really cool. So if you have any 6th through 12th graders, make sure to see Reagan about that, and Justin Ronk. But they're doing the big picture story, creation, fall, rescue, and renewal. Of course, here's the catch. Creation and fall is in the opening chapters of Genesis. The renewal is at the very end of Revelation. They're almost like bookends. The whole middle section, all the way from Genesis 3 to Revelation 20, is the rescue that involves Jesus, Israel, and then Jesus, and then the church. So once again, how does Elijah fit into all of this? That's the big picture of the Bible. Now we got to narrow down and look at the big picture of the Old Testament. And if, of course, you remember how the Old Testament is organized, we've got the 5 books of the law that set up the story of Israel, the people of Abraham, and the promise that a Savior would come through them. And they've gone into slavery in Egypt, and as we've been talking about even today with the Mosaic Covenant this morning, Moses leads them out, and now they're a nation, and they're on the way to the Promised Land. And that's what the 5 books of the law sets up, the setting up of this nation that's going to be on its way to the Promised Land to be a light in the world for God. And then we get into the next books. We'll go to the next slide here, slide 2. The Old Testament has the 5 books of the law. If you can read the red there, the next set of books is the 12 books of history. And that's where Elijah's story is going to fall into this. So that's why we've got in red the 12 books of history. And then after that, the story of the history and struggles of the nation of Israel. Then we're going to have the wisdom books, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, and so forth. That's the wisdom of Israel at the height of its kingdom. We're seeing Psalms and prayers and Proverbs from David and Solomon and the prophets as they're being a light to the world. But then, of course, as we see in the history books, the nation splits and falls into exile. And then the major prophets were the ones like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel and Daniel going to warn the nation that once you've split and you've gone into idolatry, you're going to fall apart. And then, of course, as they fall apart, we've got these minor prophets, which we've learned about before on Sunday nights. And those are the 12 minor prophets, Hosea, Joel, and Amos, and Obadiah, and those that were also going to those nations of Israel and Judah, those kingdoms, and saying, hey, turn back to the Lord. And when they did go into exile, some of those prophets went back to them as they came back into the land and said, all right, let's turn back to the Lord. And this ends right with the New Testament coming into play. So the law, the history, the wisdom, the prophets, major and minor, and I always say 5, 12, 5, 5, 12. Real easy to remember that if you can remember the 5s and the 12s. But we're going to be in the history book, so we're going to narrow down to the middle of the story now. This is after Israel's become a nation out of Egypt. They're going to be on the way to the promised land. And in the history books, we're going to see everything from Joshua coming into the land with Israel all the way till they get exiled and return back to the land before the Old Testament ends. So we're going to jump to the next slide here. And these are the history books, all 12 of them. And once again, I've got the red ones where Elijah's story falls into place. So first you got 3 books in a row. You got Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. This is the story of Israel coming into the promised land under Joshua's leadership. They win the battles, they take over the land, they allot the tribes, the 12 tribes, into their sections of land in Israel. But then, by the time of the Judges, everyone starts going their own way, and they get into this cycle of turning away from God and needing a judge or a hero to come from God to rescue them. We know some of those heroes of the faith, those judges, and they keep going through that cycle. It's a turbulent time in the land. And then finally, we've got the book of Ruth, which takes place during the time of the Judges. And Ruth's family is trying to live in that time. And we discover at the end of Ruth this amazing story of redemption, that she and her husband here become the descendants, the grandparents, all the way down to Jesse and then to David, who will be the great king of Israel. So that's how Ruth fits into the story. Joshua, Judges, Ruth. We're in the land. We've had the Judges. Ruth and their family has this promise out of their family is going to come this king. And then we get to these 4 books in red here, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. And that's where we're going to focus down in for Elijah's story. And this is the part where the nation of Israel is coming out of this turbulent time, and they're going to go from judges to kings who are going to rule over them and make a mighty nation. But when those kings seek God, it's going to go great. And when they don't seek God, it's going to go bad, as we're going to see. And what I want to do is now go to the next slide. Well, actually, we're going to stay here for just a moment. This is the struggle of Israel in the land with the kings, the good and the bad. And we'll talk through what that means as we narrow down into it. Chronicles fits in with those books as well. It's just another retelling of Kings, but from a different angle. So if Kings is told almost from the angle of the prophets, like Elijah and Elisha and others, as they're challenging these good and bad kings to follow God, Chronicles is telling the story of David and Solomon from the priestly angle. They've set up the temple to worship God in their kingdom, and are they doing the right things in the temple system and the right priests to continue that worship of God? And even when we find out that they get exiled in the history books, is there a promise that they're going to come back to the land and set up that temple again and let those sacrifices and worship continue? So it's just another angle on Kings. And you see some of the same stories about David and Solomon from a different angle, which is really neat. And then by the end of Chronicles, we've seen that the nation is split into 2. They've gone into exile, and they're in Babylon, which becomes Persia. And the last 3 books of history, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, tell the story of the 3 generations of Israelis that come back to the promised land. So in Ezra, you got Zerubbabel coming back to set things up 70 years later. And then the second wave is Ezra, and he brings the law back in so they can really worship God. And then in Nehemiah, the third wave, they start to build the wall again and get Israel or Jerusalem back up and running. And Esther fits right in between the two waves in Ezra. And she and their people are still over in Babylon, which is now Persia. And even though they're not in Jerusalem, they're still seeking God, and they're still praying for him to deliver them, even right where they're at, against outsiders and against oppression, with the hope of returning back to their land. So that's how the history books fit into play. But now we're going to zoom a little further in on the history books to just 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. So we'll go to the next slide. And my hope tonight is a lot of things happen in 1st and 2nd Samuel, in 1st and 2nd Kings, and if we can get some kind of big picture outline of what happens in those stories, you'll understand who the kings are, and you'll understand where the prophets fit in, and ultimately where Elijah fits in right when God calls him to ministry. So we're going to look at 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. We're going to go through some Bible verses that are highlights of those books that you may well know, and try to lay it out in just a very big picture, simple way. So let's jump into 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel is really a book about calling. Okay, Joshua and Judges and Ruth have happened. It's been a turbulent time. The judges have succeeded and they failed. The people have come back to God and they've come away from God. And as we see at the very beginning of 1 Samuel, the last judge is going to be born. We've got Eli in the temple, and he's not doing a great job. His sons are not really following God as the priests of the temple. And into this situation, Hannah's praying for a child and dedicating that child to the Lord. And in that prayer, we have Samuel born. Samuel will be the last judge and a new wave of the new prophets in Israel. So we see in the first 8 chapters that Samuel is called as the last judge. And God is going to call him and use him to appoint the kings of Israel. They had a lawless time with judges where everyone was doing their own thing. And finally, they're going to unite the 12 tribes under a king who hopefully will seek God. And when the king seeks God, the nation will seek God. And when the nation seeks God, there'll be a light to the world. So Samuel, in the first 8 chapters, develops as this last judge and new prophet. And in the second third of Samuel, he calls Saul to be the king. But before we get there, let's go into 1 Samuel early on with Samuel himself. We talked about chapters 1 to 8. We're going to go to 1 Samuel 3. This is a highlight in 1 Samuel. And all you got to do to remember 1 Samuel is just Samuel, Saul, and David. That's all you got to remember. So we're going to look at Samuel here. 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 1. 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 1. Should be about a third of your way through the Bible. It says this: Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord in the presence of Eli, and the word of the Lord was rare in those days, and there was no frequent vision. This is coming out of the time of the judges, and they're just not really hearing from God. But a new revival is about to hit in the land, and Samuel's going to be a huge part of that, even as a child. It says in verse 2, At that time Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim, so that he could not see, was lying down in his own place. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called Samuel, and he said, Here I am, and ran to Eli and said, Here I am, for you've called me. So Samuel thinks that Eli is the one calling him, but he said, I did not call. Lie down again. So he went and lay down. And the Lord called again, Samuel. And Samuel arose and went to Eli and said, Here I am, for you've called me. But Eli said, I did not call, my son. Lie down again. Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. This is his big calling as the last judge, the first of the new prophets. Verse 8. And the Lord called Samuel again the third time, and he arose and went to Eli and said, Here I am, for you've called me. I'm sure Eli was very tired of being woken up over and over. He's an older man now. He's just like, I need to sleep. And it says, Then Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. Therefore Eli said to Samuel, Go, lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, Speak, Lord, for your servant hears. Part of the calling in ministry is learning who the Lord is and how he reveals himself and how he talks to us. In seminary, they have a whole course just for preparation for ministry. your calling more than anything. Because if you're not called to ministry, you should minister in whatever you're trying to do. If it's not from God, it's not going to succeed. And one of the stories that we went through was this story in 1 Samuel with Samuel and his calling. And then finally in verse 10, and the Lord came and stood, calling as at other times, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel said, speak, for your servant hears. He's finally hearing the Lord. He's hearing the call. And God is going to use Samuel as this new prophet, this last judge, to call in the new king of Israel. So first we get the call of Samuel in the first third of 1 Samuel. In the second third, we're going to get Saul. Saul is going to be the new king of Israel, and we're going to jump to 1 Samuel 15. The second third of 1 Samuel is all about Saul being called to be king. 1 Samuel 15, verse 10. We're going to discover about Saul that he looks good as a king from the outside. We're tempted in ministry so often to look for leaders that have it on the outside, but we better make sure they have it on the inside, because ultimately that's most important, not just good looks or it's great to be presentable and well spoken. These are very important, but if the heart isn't right, it's not going to matter. But this is where God uses Samuel to call Saul. 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 10. And at this point, Saul is now the king, and he's been doing some right things so far. But slowly but surely that power has gone to his head. He's started to not wait on God's answers, especially in each of these battles that are occurring at this time as they're consolidating Israel after the time of the judges. And he's starting to leap ahead of God and say, well, if God's not going to answer, I'm going to go do this. And God said to destroy everything, but I'm going to keep a few things for our nation. We need it to get stronger. That's going to help God's cause. He's trying to play God himself. And at this point, he's fighting the Amalekites. And Samuel hears that Saul has not obeyed the Lord perfectly. This is another one of those famous stories in 1 Samuel with Saul's leadership. And it says this, and the word of the Lord came to Samuel, I regret that I have made Saul king, for he has turned back from following me and has not performed my commandments. And Samuel was angry, and he cried to the Lord all night. And Samuel rose early to meet Saul in the morning. And it was told Samuel, Saul came to Carmel, and behold, he set up a monument for himself, and turned and passed on and went down to Gilgal. Set up a monument for himself. Not a good idea for the king of Israel. And Samuel in verse 13 came to Saul, and Saul said to him, blessed be you to the Lord. I have performed the commandment of the Lord. And Samuel said, what then is this bleating of the sheep in my ears and the lowing of the oxen that I hear? God has said to wipe out everything, just like sin in our life. He said, take out everything or it's going to take root and come back again. It's not to be used for your benefit. It's supposed to be wiped out completely so you're fully available to serve me. And it comes by obedience. And Saul did not do that. He spared the oxen and goats. He thought, well, maybe God doesn't mean everything. And this is the trouble. And Samuel's like, if you obeyed the Lord, then why am I hearing the noises of livestock out there? You haven't. And we jump down, 1 Samuel 15, down to verse 24. After a little back and forth, Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned, for I have transgressed the commandment of the Lord and your words, because I feared the people and obeyed their voice. I think it was Charlie this morning when he was praying, or actually, you've said it, and Adam was praying in the offering too, to say, I'm thankful we have a pastor that loves our church and the people, but ultimately he's going to listen to God and what God says, and he's not going to be afraid of what people say in our culture or what naysayers are going to say. He's just going to say, this is God's word, and we're going to do what it says and speak from God. And that's what Saul was not doing here. He feared the people and obeyed their voice. Cannot have that in ministry. Whatever God calls you to do, you need to do, while loving the people and serving them. Verse 25, now therefore, please pardon my sin and return with me that I may bow before the Lord. Saul is asking Samuel. And Samuel said to Saul, I will not return with you, for you have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel. And Samuel turned to go away, and Saul seized the skirt of his robe, and it tore. And Samuel said to him, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you this day, and has given it to a neighbor of yours who is better than you." So in the first third of 1 Samuel, we've got Samuel, the call to Samuel. The second third, we've got Saul's rise to king, who looks great on the outside, but ultimately it wasn't right in his heart, and the kingdom's taken away from him. And in the next third of 1 Samuel, we're going to see David, who is called to be the future king. We're going to just jump one chapter over to 1 Samuel 16, and this is, once again, one of those great stories. 1 Samuel 16, just verses 1 and 2. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons." And Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears it, he will kill me." And the Lord basically says, go as if you're making a sacrifice there. And while you're there, you can anoint this new future king of Israel. And we go down to verse 7. And as Samuel's going to look at the sons of Jesse in Bethlehem to see which one should be king, last time he was looking at the outside with Saul. And this time in verse 7, it says, "But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him, for the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." So all 1 Samuel is all about Samuel being called up, calling a king who was not great on the inside, that's Saul on the outside, but calling a new king, a future King David, who had the right heart on the inside. In verses 10 to 13, as Samuel's looking through these sons of Jesse, he's going through each one from the oldest first, all the way down to the youngest. And it says this in verse 10, "And Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, and Samuel said to Jesse, 'The Lord has not chosen these.' Then Samuel said to Jesse, 'Are all your sons here?' And he said, 'There remains yet the youngest, but behold, he is keeping the sheep.'" They needed a shepherd to guide them as king. He didn't realize it was literally going to be a shepherd. In verse 12, "And he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. And the Lord said, 'Arise, anoint him, for this is he.' Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward." A new king is coming to Israel. But here's the catch. In 1 Samuel, he doesn't become king overnight. And that's a big clue for any of us that are called into ministry, because we learned this morning on Mount Sinai, when God called his people, he called them to be a nation, a kingdom of priests. We're all ministers. So even if we're not a king, we're still a minister. And just because we're called doesn't mean we're ready from day one to go out and minister. There's going to be a preparation time for David. In the third part of 1 Samuel, and we can go back, if you can, to the outline of 1 Samuel. The third part of 1 Samuel is going to be David called as the future king. He's still a boy. He's going to serve in the court of Saul, who's still king, and he's on the way out. And David's going to soothe him with music, and sometimes Saul's going to throw a spear at him. And David's going to become a young warrior in his army, and Saul's going to get jealous of David as he follows the Lord, and he grows in popularity as he seeks God out. But it's just a good lesson for ministry that even when we're called in, that doesn't mean we're ready to go on day one. David had to be faithful in the king's presence all those years until he was ready to serve and lead. So as we're going through 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, just remember in 1 Samuel, it's all about calling. Samuel, Saul, and David. And if you can remember that, you can find your way through the 3 parts of that book. And we're going to jump into 2 Samuel and see what happens next as David goes from learner now to actually becoming the rightful king of Israel. In 2 Samuel, we'll go to the next slide here. David's rise as king of Israel is the first third of 2 Samuel. And we're going to look at a passage here in 2 Samuel chapter 7. This is David as he's coming to power. He's going to unite all 12 tribes that were always fighting against each other, were never fully unified. And he's going to make Salem, which means peace, or Jerusalem, God's house of peace, into the capital to really unite the people in a way that they had never been united before. But you can see in this passage, 2 Samuel 7, verse 1, you can see this heart that David has after God. 2 Samuel 7, verses 1 to 3. This is a highlight in the book of 2 Samuel here. It says this, "Now when the king lived in his house," this is David, "and the Lord had given him rest from all his surrounding enemies, the king said to Nathan the prophet, 'See now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells in a tent.'" David cared more about God and worshiping him in a great place than having a fancy place for himself. And Nathan said to the king, "Go do all that is in your heart, for the Lord is with you." Now we're going to jump down to verse 11 here. Like I said, we're just doing highlights. It says, God says to David, "From the time that I appointed judges over my people Israel, we've seen this violence against the nation." He says, "And I will give you rest from all your enemies." This is when the nation of Israel really comes to power. "And I will give you rest. Moreover, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who will come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son." Now, you could say we're looking forward to Solomon, but ultimately here we're looking forward to the whole Davidic kingdom, the whole line, all the way to Jesus. A house that will last forever, and I will be to him a father, and he to me a son. When he commits iniquity, now this is back to Solomon once again. These are all pictures of Jesus, the good parts, along the way in the Old Testament. All these different people that we're learning about. Sometimes they really followed God great, and we see Jesus in them, and sometimes they didn't. That's not Jesus. So it says this, "When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men, but my steadfast love will not depart from him." This is important because as we get towards Solomon, David's son, when he gets disciplined, it's not going to be from God the same way Saul got disciplined. Saul got rejected as king in the kingly line. David's line is going to go on forever, even though there's going to be kings along the way that don't honor and follow God. They're not going to be disciplined the same way from God and be cut off from the kingdom forever. Their descendants will go on eventually to Jesus. They're going to be punished by people, by nations, by armies, but not necessarily cut off by God, because they are now going to have a house in the kingdom forever. And it says, "But my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever." In accordance with all these words, and in accordance with all this vision, Nathan the prophet spoke to David. So as we go into 2 Samuel, there's three parts here. First is this house for David. He wanted to build a house for God, the temple. We're going to find out that he's not the man to build it. But because of that heart, God is going to use David's line all the way to Jesus and establish a house and a kingdom for him forever. In the first third of 2 Samuel, you see the kingdom on the rise under a good leadership of David. And that's a good lesson for us in ministry, once again, is if we're seeking God out and caring more about him and making his name great, then we're going to prosper, and that kingdom ministry is going to grow. So we see some neat leadership lessons in this whole section from David. The second third of 2 Samuel is now the sin of David. You see his throne going up, and then it makes a turn at chapter 11, and we're going to go to chapter 15 to see it. But you start to see the downturn in, we're going to go to chapter 11, like I said. 2 Samuel 11, we're going to see the downturn in the second third of 2 Samuel with David's throne here. 2 Samuel 11, verses 1 to 5. Remember, this whole time he's been winning battles. He's consolidating the land, defeating the enemies, bringing the tribes together, bringing all the leadership under Jerusalem. He wants to build that house of worship for God and be a nation that seeks after God. At the height of his power, 2 Samuel 11, verse 1. In the spring of the year, the time when the kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him in all Israel. And they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained at Jerusalem. David was always going out with the army. He had been a soldier in Saul's army. He was leading, and he was always praying in each battle, God, what do you want us to do? And I'll follow whatever you say. And now he's got this bigger kingdom, and he decides to stay back, which was his purpose. And I think in ministry a lot of times, when we get away from God's purpose for us, and we get focused on other things, that's when we can fall with things that happen in our life. In this case, temptations and sin. Identity and purpose are some things that can really focus us. And when you're doing ministry and you're called, you're not focused on yourself and your desires and what you want. You're just focused on him, and you don't have time to think for yourself. You're still getting a great blessing out of it. But the moment you take your eyes off of God and his purpose and try to enjoy the ministry that you felt like you built, that's when things can start to come crashing down. So David stayed at Jerusalem, verse 2. And like I said, these are highlights of 2 Samuel. It happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house, that he saw from the roof a woman bathing, and that woman was very beautiful. And David sent and inquired about the woman, and one said, is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? So David sent messengers and took her. And she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she had been purifying herself from her uncleanness. Then she returned to her house, and the woman conceived, and she sent and told David, I'm pregnant. Big mistake that happens right here. Same mistake. It's worse than that. But this is where David's throne starts to really crumble as he was doing so well. And now we're going to jump ahead to verse 14. This is when David is now trying to cover up the sin with Bathsheba as she's pregnant. And he knows that her husband is Uriah. He's called him back from the war so that maybe Uriah will go home and be with his wife, and then she'll be pregnant, and he'll never realize it was really David. But Uriah is so dedicated as a soldier, he won't go home when he knows his fellow soldiers are over there in battle. And David's plan is failing. So in verse 14, in the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. In the letter he wrote, set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him, that he may be struck down and die. It starts as a small thing, going off to look what he shouldn't look at, and leads into going to a person that he shouldn't be with and doing something he shouldn't do. And then it goes from that all the way to plotting and to murder. And as we learned today from Brother Robert about the 10 Commandments and Jesus's statement in Matthew 5 about the heart of the commandment, just because you didn't do the murder yourself, you wanted it done in your heart. And that's the deal. You can say you didn't murder them, but you still plotted to have them killed, and it came from your order, and those men had no choice but to obey it. So really, David is the murderer there. And this is where, like I said, it starts to crumble down. In verse 17, and the men of the city came out and fought with Joab and some of the servants of David, and among the people fell. Uriah the Hittite also died. And then we jump ahead to verse 26 and 27 at the end of the chapter. When the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she lamented over her husband. And when the mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing that David had done had displeased the Lord. At least he took her in after she was now a widow and had no rights and no property. And he took her in and gave her a home, but everything had been done wrong. That child had been born wrong. But God always has a plan. But God was not pleased with what David has done. And this is the second third of 2 Samuel, the sin of David. And you start to see a trajectory from here. David is going to have to pay for that sin. That child is going to die. Didn't deserve it, but that was the result of David's sin. And what we do so often affects others, which is so important in our family, in ministry, and other places. So we have to be so careful about that. Eventually, we're going to see that David's not taking care of his family, and another sexual scene happens with his son and daughter from different wives, and Absalom. And there's some neglect that happens there. And Absalom, his son, rebels against David and tries to take the kingdom from David. So as we're going through 2 Samuel, and we had the height of David, now we're going down, and David actually has to evacuate Jerusalem and get out of Israel and go to one of his lowest points because of the sin that was following him. Once again, God said, I'm not going to strike you the same way, but other people are going to strike you when you disobey me. Because that house is going to go on forever, but there's still going to be repercussions when David sins. And then by the end of 2 Samuel, we see David finally get that kingdom back. The difference between Saul and David is that David really was a man of God's heart, and even when he messed up, he confessed it to Nathan in 2 Samuel 12. Nathan comes to him, and Nathan tells a story about someone else, a hypothetical story, and says, what would you do? Would you punish that guy for what he did? And David said, of course I would. I would punish him to the full extent of the law. And Nathan said, David, you are that man. You're the one who did it. But right there, David could have denied it, and he didn't. And he said, I'm guilty, and I did it, and I need to turn away from that and turn back to God. We see that in Psalm 51 and Psalm 32, where David is pleading to God, and you can see his heart, that he knows he's sinned. And then in Psalm 32, the wasting away till he finally confessed it, and the joy of getting back right with God, even if he had to pay many consequences for that. And the nation was put into some turmoil. But the book of 2 Samuel ends on a high note. David is back in leadership, back as king, back in his throne. And the last part of 2 Samuel is David's final days as king. He's able to consolidate that kingdom. He's got his mighty men that go out and score some great victories. And he gives those parting words as he's preparing his son, Solomon, who is a child of him and Bathsheba. And that's interesting. David loses that first child with Bathsheba because of the transgression, but they get another child, Solomon, whose name means gift from God. And he ends up becoming the king of Israel and the one who Jesus is born through that line. So God can even use those sinful situations to bring something good out of. If we'll just turn back to him, he can still use us. So 2 Samuel is those three parts: the rise of David, the fall. If we can go back to that slide, thank you. The rise of David as king in the first 10 chapters, then his fall with his sin with Bathsheba, and then Absalom's rebellion, and then finally in the last 5 or 6 chapters, his final days as king, as he's preparing for Solomon to take over for him. So once again, 1 Samuel, Saul, David. 2 Samuel, David's rise, David's fall, and his final days as king. And now we're going to get into 1 Kings and see what happens next with his son Solomon, who's going to inherit this great kingdom that David had been building. And we'll go to the next slide here. This chapter is really two halves. The one in red is where we finally see Elijah's story come into play. So I'll help you. They can see it good on the live stream, but with these lights, it's a little hard to see. But the first half of 1 Kings is all about this united kingdom under Solomon. Some neat things happen here. Once again, David has found out that he's not going to be able to build that temple. He was a warrior for God. They're going to need someone else to build it. But the first thing Solomon does as king that's pretty neat, and this is a highlight in 1 Kings, is 1 Kings chapter 3. We're going to go to 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 3 to 5. 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 3 to 5. And once again, 1 Kings, the first half is all about Solomon being king over Israel and all the great things that happen. And this is why it happens. 1 Kings 3, verses 3 to 5. Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David his father. Only he sacrificed and made offerings at the high places. He was still doing some things he shouldn't have been, but he loved God, and God was working with him. And the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. Solomon used to offer 1,000 burnt offerings at that altar. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, Ask what I shall give you. And we jump down to verse 9. Solomon says, "Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to govern this, your great people?" So of all the things Solomon could have asked for, riches, fame, and popularity, which would be very dangerous for ministry, very, very dangerous. And we see those guys out there, whether they're being successful or not, very dangerous. He asked for the wisdom to lead. And that was a huge thing. When you have the genie and Aladdin come to you and say you can wish for whatever you want, and he asked for God's wisdom, not the world's wisdom, but God's wisdom to lead. And look what happens in verses 10 to 14 here. "It pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this. And God said to him, because you have asked this and have not asked for yourself long life or riches or the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern what is right, behold, I now do according to your word. Behold, I give you a wise and discerning mind, so that none like you has been before you, and none like you shall rise after you. I give you also what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that no other king shall compare with you all your days." He didn't ask for the riches and honor, but God gave it to him anyway, because he asked for wisdom, just like David, a man after God's heart in this scene here. That first half of 1 Kings is all about that united kingdom under Solomon, and because he's asked for wisdom, God's going to take that nation of Israel to even higher heights than David had. Then we learn that Solomon is the one to build the temple, and they don't just have a movable tabernacle for God. They now have the Jerusalem, the capital, all 12 tribes united as a nation, and they now have the temple where they have a permanent place to offer those sacrifices to God and have the festivals and feasts. And they have just a huge amount of sacrifices and prayer and worship. The smoke fills the temple so much they can't even worship in there. The Lord's presence is so strong. But by the end of that first half, 1 Kings 11, by the end of that first half, we start to see the downfall of Solomon. God had warned all the way back in Deuteronomy, if you ever have a king in the land. And he had warned through Samuel, in 1 Samuel, if you ever have a king in the land, and they go after having great amounts of horses and great amounts of wives and concubines and great amounts of money, their heart could turn away. And then we go to 1 Kings 11, 1-6, another highlight here in 1 Kings, and we see what happens to Solomon, who was seeking after God, but it all came crashing down. It says, "Now King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women from the nations, concerning which the Lord had said to the people of Israel, you shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn your heart away after their gods. Solomon clung to these in love. He had 700 wives who were princesses and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away from his heart. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not wholly follow the Lord as David his father had done. You go down to verses 11 to 13. Therefore, the Lord said to Solomon, since this has been your practice, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes that I've commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant. Yet for the sake of David your father, I will not do it in your days, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son, who's going to be Rehoboam. However, I will not tear away all the kingdom, but I will give you one tribe to your son, for the sake of David my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem that I have chosen. So God's telling him, you're going to lose the kingdom not in your time, but in your son's time. 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, are going to stay with you. 10 tribes, the tribes of the north, are going to go to your servant, who will be king over them. And after Solomon dies at the end of that chapter, the first half of 1 Kings is all about Solomon doing well, and his kingdom is growing, and then he turns away from God. And the second half is where we see this united kingdom divided. And it starts in chapter 12. We have Rehoboam, Solomon's son. We have Jeroboam, the servant of Solomon. And Jeroboam has been on the run from Solomon. Now that Solomon's dead, Jeroboam comes back to Solomon's son Rehoboam and says, okay, are you going to be a better king in those final years than Solomon was? Rehoboam has a choice here in 1 Samuel 12. He can either go to his older, wiser advisors. This is a very famous passage. And he goes to them and they say, hey, you've been too hard on the people, taxing them and overworking them. Your father had done that. If you will just give them a break and show them that you care about them, you'll have a nation that loves you and serves you. But he doesn't take their advice. He goes to the younger advisors, his friends, who he put into positions of power. And they said, no, make it harder on them. Show them who's really king. And that's what Rehoboam decides to do. And Jeroboam rebels, and he takes those 10 kingdoms away, and he forms the northern nation of Israel. And Solomon just has Judah and Benjamin, the southern kingdom of Judah. So the second half of 1 Kings is now all about these two kingdoms, northern Israel and southern Judah. And that is in the red. If we go back to our outline, that is exactly where Elijah comes in. We've seen the rise of Samuel, the rise of King Saul, the rise of David, David's son Solomon, in a united kingdom, now a divided kingdom with Israel and Judah. And we see the king of the north. You see Jeroboam set up a new place to worship at Dan, and they worship these golden calves and get into pagan worship. They didn't want all the people going to the southern kingdom, to Jerusalem, to worship at the temple. You now have competing nations with competing capitals and competing temples, competing sacrifices, and competing religions. And in the second half of 1 Kings, the sad thing is you've got bad kings in Israel and you've got bad kings in Judah. And this is where those major and minor prophets start to get called to go to those two kingdoms and tell the people you need to go back to God. Doesn't like the disunity. He doesn't like the idolatry and the pagan practices. And we get a little focus on that northern kingdom because it was even more evil. And you see in this next part, second half of 1 Kings, where Elijah comes into play. So we're going to go to the next slide. Within chapters 12 to 22, we're going to now go. Oh, I'm sorry. Go back one more. You had it right. Thank you. Right there in the red, it's going to be chapters 17, 18, and 19 of 1 Kings. That's where we see Elijah come onto the scene. And as Brother Robert's been doing the past few weeks, we won't go through it all again. But in chapter 17, this is where Elijah prays, and there's a drought upon the land. That gets King Ahab's attention. And, of course, that causes conflict. And we learn from Brother Robert in the story in 1 Kings 17, now that we know right where it is, that he goes to the brook of Cherith, and the ravens provide for him during that drought. And he goes to the widow of Naboth, and the widow provides for him in that scene. And it's a preparation time for Elijah once again. We need that preparation time in ministry. And the most important thing we can do is just follow what God says, even if he calls us to some obscure places. He has command of everything, and he can take care of us. It's an important lesson in ministry. He'll call us to some obscure places in the background, hiding out, and just say, I'll provide for you. You're not sure how you're going to get your money and be taken care of and do all the things you do? Then you got a group of 2 people you're ministering to. I'll provide for you. In chapter 17, it's Elijah in the drought. Chapter 18, this is 1 Kings, it's Elijah versus the prophets of Baal. Up on Mount Carmel, 400 prophets of Baal serving King Ahab versus just Elijah. As we learned with Brother Robert, just being obedient to God, God's power is going to win out. No matter how much is against you and how overwhelming the scene looks, trust God and just do what he called you to do, and you'll see the victory. Because it's all about God and his name and his kingdom, not you anyway. And that's chapter 18. You see a huge victory over this hold on Israel with these prophets of Baal. And then in chapter 19, which we're going to get to soon, and I don't want to spoil that, but you now see Elijah after this great ministry victory, all of a sudden going on the run and getting so low and depressed he almost wants to die. The heights that we have in ministry, sometimes that we're celebrating can come right before a fall or a low point. You go to summer camp. We know this. You go to Disciple Now for the youth, and you see these great things happen, these revivals, and you're on a high, and then you don't realize that you come back to everyday life, and students start going their own way, and this happens, and this happens, and this happens, and you wish you had just gotten to stay back at that mountain. Mount Carmel's a pretty place. We went there in Israel. It's more beautiful than you think. It would have been nice to just stay up there, but they've got to go back down. And so Elijah goes from a high point to a very low point in that story. He's on the run, but God ministers to him, and then God restores him, and then he calls Elijah to go and call the next prophet, Elisha, at the end of that chapter, which, once again, we're going to save all that for Brother Robert. But now we're starting to see in the second half of 1 Kings with the divided nation why Elijah is called to go in and challenge the northern king of Israel and evil King Ahab to turn away from idols and turn back to the living God. And then we're going to finish up here with 2 Kings. And the next slide. Once Elijah has turned over his ministry to Elisha, the first third of 2 Kings is all about his ministry. Elisha prayed and asked God to have even a double portion of the power and ministry of Elijah. That's not a bad thing to ask, because if it's not about you and it's about God, he may answer that. And what we see with Elisha, who's not as well known a lot of times as Elijah, he's got more chapters dedicated to him, 8 instead of 3. He does double the amount of miracles that Elijah ever does. And as the nation of Israel in the north is crumbling down, we see some revivals start to try to happen in 2 Kings. 1 Kings is all about the idolatry that brings Solomon down, and the northern and southern kingdom split apart, and Elijah have to go minister. 2 Kings is all about revivals trying to happen. Elisha trying to bring revivals, but that northern kingdom is so stubborn. Every one of their 19 kings is evil. And then even through Elisha, those revivals just don't happen. Even Ahab almost comes around. At the end, you don't hear that very often. He almost comes around to God when he was so far away. Jezebel, his wife, gets taken down. And Jehu, who is a pretty bloodthirsty commander in Ahab's army, actually gets called by God to seize power, and he actually destroys and takes out all of Baal worship. He was pretty ruthless. He took out Ahab's family, clean slate, took out the prophets of Baal once and for all, but he still kept worshiping at Dan, that capital, still kept worshiping at the high places. He got rid of a lot of sin in the land, but he didn't get rid of it all. So even Jehu's somewhat bloodthirsty revival just doesn't happen. In the second third of 2 Kings, we see finally the fall of Israel to Assyria. Assyria comes in and just whittles them down and just takes them. And they take the northern kingdom of Israel that wouldn't turn back to God and just scatters them to the wind, never to be heard from again. They take them out of the land completely, disperse them among the Assyrian nations, and they bring other peoples into that northern area of Israel that were not Israelites. Those will later become the area of Samaria by the time of the New Testament, and you see why Jesus, his disciples don't want to go there. Those were people from another place. Why they didn't want to do ministry there. Those were not Israelites. They would stay in Galilee, and they'd go all the way around Samaria down to Judah centuries later because of that. So the northern kingdom falls in the second third of 2 Kings to Assyria. Judah is limping along with bad king, then good king, then bad king, then good king. We see these little bits of revival trying to happen with Hezekiah. Hezekiah is a great story. In 2 Kings 18, you see this revival by Hezekiah that's starting to happen, tearing down those high places of idolatry in the southern kingdom of Judah. And it just doesn't fully take place, but he was one of those great kings in the southern kingdom that they did have. And then a few generations later, Josiah comes up at 8 years old in 2 Kings 22, and he leads that revival. They find the book of the law in the temple and get back to God's word and tear down those places of their ancestors. But still, you've got kings like Manasseh that come up that Brother Robert mentioned. And once again, that revival, that spark doesn't light. And at the last third of 2 Kings, Judah falls to Babylon. So we had Elisha trying to do a revival. Didn't work. You have Israel fall to Assyria. Even Jehu's revival didn't work. And finally, Judah falls to Babylon. And even with kings like Hezekiah and Josiah, didn't happen. And they go off to Babylon. And that's where we pick up at the end of the history books with Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther as they're coming back out of that 70 years of exile, ready to do this one more time and do it the right way. But we see where Elijah's story falls in now in the second half of 1 Kings, and why the nation split into two, and why there's so much idolatry, and why he's called into that time of ministry is a huge deal. We're going to end with this. Coming back to 1 and 2 Samuel and 1 and 2 Kings, this heart of the history books of the Old Testament, what can we learn about them for us? Real simply is this. We have another slide here. What can we learn in 1 and 2 Samuel? And I don't want to oversimplify this too much, but I just want to leave you with something you can take with you. You can go back in and read all the stories for yourself. It reads like a movie or a TV show. They should just film the books of 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, just unaltered, and that'll be a better show than anything on TV. You'll have to censor it a little bit, but it'll be better than any of those other copycat shows out there. 1 Samuel is all about calling, once again. Samuel's called to minister. Saul was called, but on the outside he had it, but not on the inside. And he didn't obey. And then David was called, and he was called to be a servant for a long time before he finally became king, but he had the right heart. It's all about calling. Samuel, Saul, and David. 2 Samuel is all about leadership. We learn from David how to do things right and how to obey God, and how you and everyone around you in your ministry, everything benefits from that. Like Brother Robert talked about today, blessings versus curses. But then we learn what happens when you take your eyes off him and become about yourself and get into temptation and sin, and how it not only affects you, but everyone around you as that falls down. And finally, how David ends on a good note because he does have a heart for God, and he comes back to God. And God has established that kingdom forever that's going to one day lead to Jesus. So it's all about leadership lessons that we can learn in 2 Samuel. Now we go to 1 Kings, which is, once again, a lot about idolatry. You see King Solomon starting so well, asking for wisdom, building the temple, the presence of God right there, united the kingdom. This is the height of the kingdom. People are coming from all over the world to hear these proverbs, hear this wisdom, and learn about the one true God who can save. But once again, idolatry in Solomon's life, with all the trappings of this earth, the wives and the property and the money, just get to him, and leads to a split in the nation. And you see idolatry in the north with Israel, and in the south with Judah. And that's where Elijah and the prophets come in to challenge that idolatry. And then finally in 2 Kings, and like I said, this is just big picture ideas. You'll find idolatry and revival in both of those books, but by and large, you try to see these revivals get going. They never quite take effect. Whether it's Elisha and just so much around him, but he was faithful to what God called him to, and that's what matters in a revival. Faithful to what God calls. There's a lot more going on than just you. And then once again, even with Jehu, who was trying to bring about revival, but not in the right way, using the tools of man and still not letting go of all the idolatry. And then finally, even with some great kings like Hezekiah and Josiah, those kings in between didn't let it happen. And you see that revival does not fully take effect. But if you're going to do it right, we learn from Hezekiah, you got to tear all that stuff down. Even if you have to go in the middle of the night, tear it down. I don't care if it's your father's or your grandfather's, tear it down. And you learn from Josiah, it's all about God's word. That's what sparks the revival. When we know what God says, like Brother Robert said on Sunday mornings, what he's revealed and what he wants us to do is about revival. So hopefully, like I said, this look into the history books will kind of give you an understanding of how the nation of Israel got started, and how they went from judges to kings, and how they went to a great king, and how it went up and how it went down and how it split into two, and the idolatry hit, and that's where Elijah comes into the picture. So next week, as Brother Robert comes back into the story, and we've already seen Elijah at Cherith, and Elijah with the widow of Naboth, and Elijah against the prophets of Baal in chapter 17, 18 of 1 Kings, and chapter 19, we'll see him go from this great height of ministry victory down to the depths, but God is still there, and ministry is still going to happen. So let's go ahead and pray. Father, we thank you for you more than anything. Thank you that we can have a relationship with you. that you've made it so clear that only through Jesus, your Son, the ultimate King, can we be a part of your nation and a part of your family. Thank you for Jesus' sacrifice, and thank you for his resurrection, King of the whole world, King of the whole universe. May we make him King of our lives. Father, thank you for your word. Help us to know your word. Help us to know everything about it so we can know more who you are and know more what you've been doing in the world before we even came onto the scene. Father, what you've promised one day in the future and what you're calling us to do today, Father. For everyone here, whatever ministry you've called us to do as part of being that light to the nations, Father, help us to seek that calling from you, and help us to learn how to lead in that calling, even if it starts small and we're serving in obscure places. Father, never let that please go to our head and make us go down the wrong path, chasing the wrong things. Father, for us and for our nation, help us not to fall more and more into idolatry until there's no going back. Help us to have a revival, Father, in this nation that starts in our hearts, that starts with your word, and that leads us back to you. We want to be a nation that seeks after you. Father, like Elijah, who's just a regular guy with a nature like ours, we'd pray that we would have that kind of power in prayer for whatever you want to happen, that we would believe it and that we trust it, and we let you work through us to make your name great and to make your kingdom grow. And Father, may you get all the glory, and for your Son, our King Jesus. Amen.